Liam O'Brien had heard the stories growing up in his small Irish town. Every St. Patrick's Eve, someone went missing. Some blamed the thick fog that rolled in from the hills. Others whispered about the curse of the Forgotten One, an old legend about a man who had been left to die in a bog, cursing the town with his final breath. Liam O'Brien had become nothing more than a name added to the long list of the lost. But his sister, Maeve, refused to forget. She had seen the footprints, she had heard the whispers, and she had watched Liam vanish into the darkness, even though no one believed her. On the following St. Patrick's Eve, Maeve returned to the bog. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground sloshed under her boots. She held a lantern close, its flickering flame the only warmth in the cold, soupy fog. The wind carried voices, distant, sobbing, pleading. Then she saw it. A figure, hanging from a wooden post. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Liam. His face was twisted in horror, skin shriveled and tight, his mouth agape like he had died mid-scream. His body was stitched into the scarecrow with rusted wire, his hollow eyes following her as she stepped closer. A choked sob escaped her lips. Liam! Then his head twitched. His cracked lips moved. Maeve, run! A hand shot from the bog, wrapping around her ankle. She shrieked, stumbling back, but more hands erupted from the muck, dozens of them, clawing, grabbing, pulling. Faces emerged, rotting, melting, screaming, the Forgotten Ones. And then, the creature came. It towered over her, its shape shifting like smoke and shadow, eyes glowing like embers in the dark, a mouth split open, rows of jagged teeth grinning. One of you must take his place. Maeve clawed at the ground, kicking, thrashing. The creature reached down with long, bony fingers, pressing against her forehead. Her skull burned. Visions flooded her mind, faces of the lost, screams echoing through the centuries, bodies trapped beneath the bog, writhing in endless torment. And then she understood. There was no escaping, there was only the trade. Through the agony, she forced herself to whisper, "Not me." The creature tilted its head, waiting. She took a ragged breath, and she whispered a name. Cian Murphy. The creature shuddered, the bog roared like a living thing, and somewhere, in the town of Killarney, Cian Murphy awoke screaming. Maeve gasped as the hands let go, the faces sank back into the muck, the lantern flickered out. Silence. She crawled forward, reaching for Liam, but his body collapsed into dust, scattering into the wind. The scarecrow post stood empty, waiting for the next sacrifice. And behind her, in the blackness of the bog, something whispered, "See you next year." Liam never believed in it. Superstitions were for old drunks and bored children. This year, St. Patrick's Eve fell on a stormy night. The wind howled through the trees like a wailing banshee, and the rain came down in sheets. Liam and his friends were out late, stumbling home after a long night of drinking. The town's streets were eerily empty, save for the occasional flicker of candlelight in old windows. That's when they heard it. A whisper. Low, raspy, almost inside their heads. "You left me, now you'll stay." The group froze. "Who the hell said that?" Liam asked, laughing nervously. Then he saw them, footprints, fresh, muddy prints appearing one after another, forming right in front of them, leading towards the woods. "Run," someone whispered, but none of them moved. The footprints stopped, and from the shadows, a shape rose, a grotesque, elongated figure, its face a tangle of rotting flesh and sunken eyes, its mouth stretched open, revealing jagged blackened teeth. "One of you must take my place." Liam turned to run, but his friends were already screaming. Something was dragging them away. Long, skeletal hands burst from the ground, clutching their ankles, pulling them down into the wet earth. He grabbed for Shane, his oldest friend, but as their hands met, Shane's body split open like rotten wood, his eyes rolling back, his scream muffled as the ground swallowed him whole. Then the thing turned to Liam. "You will remember." Liam's mouth opened to scream, but something cold and wet slid down his throat. He gagged as the taste of swamp and decay filled his lungs. His vision blurred, his skin tightened and cracked like old leather. The next morning, St. Patrick's Day began as usual, green banners, beer flowing, music playing, but no one noticed the new scarecrow in the bog, its face stretched in a silent scream, its eyes still wet with terror. And no one noticed that Liam was gone. That night, The whisper came again. One of you must take my place. The town of Killarney didn't talk about disappearances. They drank, they danced, they sang, but when the celebrations ended, they locked their doors and ignored the missing. Maeve never spoke of what happened in the bog. Her body burned, her head ached, her veins felt like they were filled with ice. And then she saw them. The footprints. They led from her bed to the door, wet and muddy. She choked back a sob, scrambling for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she typed a message to Cian. "Help me, please." No response. A shadow shifted in the corner of the room. The air grew thick, damp, filled with the stench of rotting earth. Then the whisper came. "One of you must take my place." Maeve bolted for the door. She stumbled down the stairs, out into the freezing night. The town was silent. No music, no laughter, not a single soul in sight. Something was wrong. She ran, heart pounding, straight to Cian's house. The door was unlocked. Inside, she found him sitting at the kitchen table, a blank stare on his face, an untouched beer in his shaking hand. "You," her voice cracked, "you said my name." Cian didn't look at her. Maeve felt rage rise in her chest. "You traded me?" His lip quivered. I had no choice." She lunged at him, shaking him by the collar. "You coward! You were supposed to break the curse, not pass it on." Tears streamed down his face. "You did it first, Maeve," he shouted. "You said my name first. I just wanted to live." Maeve staggered back, breathless. He was right. She had done this to him. And now, it was happening again. The lights in the house flickered. A shadow passed over the window, too tall to be human. It was here. Maeve's blood turned to ice. She grabbed Cian's hand. "We have to run, now." They sprinted into the night. The town stretched before them, but it was wrong, warped like a fogged mirror. Buildings were leaning, their windows dark and watching. The streets were cracked, pulsing like living skin. And then they saw the others. People stood in the streets, the lost ones. Bodies half decayed, eyes hollow, mouths whispering the same thing over and over and over. "One of you must take my place." Maeve and Cian ran. They sprinted toward the church, the only place that still looked normal. The doors were open. Inside, candles burned. The air was thick with incense, the smell of something old. A priest stood at the altar, Father Doyle. He turned to them, his face pale, his hands trembling. "You should not have come here." Maeve gasped. "Please, help us." Father Doyle's eyes darkened. "The curse must be fed." Then he smiled. Maeve's stomach lurched. Cian screamed. The priest's body twisted, his skin splitting open, his bones cracking like dry wood. He was never a priest. He had never been human. The doors slammed shut. The candles died. And in the darkness, a voice whispered, "One of you must take my place." Maeve felt hands clawing at her skin, cold, wet, pulling her under. Cian sobbed, "Please, not me, not me." Maeve turned to him, realizing he was going to say another name. The ground split open. The church collapsed into the bog. And Killarney woke up the next morning, the streets full of music, the bars full of drink. No one asked where Maeve O'Brien had gone. And far away, in a dark, rotting bog, a new scarecrow stood. Its face frozen in a silent, eternal scream. But Cian Murphy? He knew. The moment Maeve whispered his name, something changed inside him. He felt it, a sickness deep in his bones, like something was crawling beneath his skin. He tried to ignore it. Then the nightmares came. He saw the bog. He saw the scarecrow post, waiting. And he saw them. The ones who had been swallowed. They whispered his name, their fingers clawed at the earth, their mouths filled with mud, eyes wide with terror. And behind them, the creature loomed grinning, waiting to claim him. Cian stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. The dark circles under his eyes grew deep and hollow, his once strong body thinning like a corpse. He tried to run. He took the first ferry to England, his hands shaking as the boat left the Irish shore. He thought he was safe. He thought distance could break the curse. He was wrong. March 16th, St. Patrick's Eve. Cian sat alone in a London pub, nursing a drink with trembling hands. Rain battered the windows, and outside, the city pulsed with life, people laughing, celebrating, unaware. Then he saw it. A wet footprint. On the floor. Inside. His stomach twisted into ice. He turned, heart pounding, but the pub was packed with revelers. No one else noticed. Then another footprint appeared. And another. Leading toward him. A whisper slid into his ear, low and rasping, a voice that wasn't human. "One of you must take my place." His drink slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. His breath came in ragged gasps as the pub around him seemed to fade. The noise, the people, the lights all gone. He was standing in the bog. Cold mud rose around his ankles, climbing his calves. The wooden post stood in front of him, empty, waiting. A shadow moved in the mist. The creature. It had found him. Kian screamed, thrashing, trying to run, but the ground split beneath him. Hands rotting, bloated, human hands clawed their way out, grasping at his flesh. The whisper came again, but now, it was a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison. "One of you must take my place." His mind shattered, his body seized. And then he understood. If he didn't choose someone, he would become the next scarecrow. His breath came in short, panicked sobs. He had to trade. His mind raced. Who could he offer? He thought of his brother, his cousin, his best friend. Then he thought of Maeve. She had done this to him. She had said his name. His lips moved before he could stop them. Maeve O'Brien. The whispering stopped. The hands let go. The fog curled around him, and suddenly he was back. Kian stared at the screen, his heart hammering. The bog had accepted the trade. Kian Murphy didn't sleep that night. Just like they never talked about Maeve O'Brien, or Liam O'Brien, or any of the others. Every year, someone went missing. Every year, the town pretended it didn't happen. The beer still flowed, the music still played, the laughter still echoed through the streets. Because that's how the curse worked. As long as they forgot, as long as they didn't speak their names, the bog would stay quiet. It would wait until next year. But one person never forgot. Bridget Kavanaugh, a local girl barely 20, had grown up hearing the whispers. She had seen the missing posters vanish overnight. She had noticed the empty chairs at the pubs, the way no one mourned. And she had seen the scarecrow. She had walked past the bog one morning, when the mist was low. And there it was. It looked new. Flesh-colored. And its eyes were still wet. Bridget ran home that day, sick with fear, but she couldn't let it go. She started digging, old newspapers, church records, obituaries that never existed. The town had been feeding the bog for centuries. The names changed, the stories changed, but the pattern never did. Every St. Patrick's Eve, the bog took someone. And the town let it. Bridget knew she had to leave. She packed her bags, bought a bus ticket to Dublin, and told herself she'd never look back. But that night, March 16th, as she sat in her bedroom, a cold whisper slid through the cracks of her window. "Bridget Kavanaugh, I see you." Her breath hitched. The wind outside died. The house fell silent. Then, a single, wet footprint appeared on her bedroom floor. Bridget screamed. She grabbed her bag and ran, bolting through the empty streets, past the pubs full of unbothered, drunken fools. No one noticed her, no one cared. She reached the bus station, hands shaking as she slammed her ticket onto the counter. "One to Dublin, now." The old man at the counter didn't move. He just stared at her. Then, slowly, he smiled. "You should have forgotten, lass." Bridget's stomach dropped. Behind her, the bus was gone. The station was gone. Everything was gone. The town was gone. She was standing in the bog. The mist curled around her. And there, in the distance, was the empty scarecrow post? Waiting. Bridget turned, heart slamming against her ribs, but hands were already reaching for her. Muddy, rotting, familiar hands. She saw Kian's face, Maeve's face, Liam's face. All whispering. "One of you must take my place." Bridget screamed. The ground split beneath her. And as she sank into the blackness, her last thought was not of fear, or pain, or even regret. It was this. Next year, someone else will take my place. And then, the town forgot her. The celebrations continued. The laughter never stopped. And out in the bog, a new scarecrow stood. Until next year. He didn't drink. He didn't celebrate St. Patrick's Day with the rest of Killarney. Because he knew. He knew Maeve was gone. The town didn't care. The music played, the beer flowed, and the laughter filled the air. But Cian sat alone in his darkened house, listening to the wind howl outside. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, his heartbeat wouldn't slow. Because the bog wasn't done with him. It had let him live again. But now, something inside him felt wrong. He pulled up his sleeve. His skin looked gray, damp, small patches of moss clung to his arms, his nails were turning black. His body was changing. Then came the whisper. You took my place, but you were never meant to leave. Cian bolted upright, knocking over his chair. He wasn't alone. He turned slowly. Maeve stood in the doorway. Or at least, what was left of her. Her skin was stretched too tight, her lips torn into a permanent scream, her hollowed-out eyes dripping black sludge. The scarecrow had come home. Cian stumbled back. Maeve. Her head snapped at an unnatural angle. A wet, gurgling sound escaped her throat. Not Maeve anymore. Cian choked on a scream as the lights flickered and the walls of his house began to rot. Wood cracked, mold spread, the floor sank beneath his feet like it was turning to swamp. The bog had come for him. He turned to run, but Maeve moved impossibly fast, her fingers stretching into long, jagged claws. She grabbed his throat and slammed him against the wall. You traded me, she hissed, her breath thick with the stench of mud and decay. Now, you take my place. Cian's vision blurred, his body froze. The house melted around him, the walls dissolving into thick, black water. And suddenly, he was in the bog. The scarecrow post loomed before him, empty, waiting. Cian tried to scream, but his mouth filled with mud, his lungs burned. His body sank into the filth, hands pulling him under, voices whispering in his ears. One of you must take my place. But there was no one left to trade. Cian Murphy had no more names to say. The curse always wins. And that morning, as the St. Patrick's Day celebrations raged on, the townspeople noticed something new. Out in the bog, where the mist never lifted, a new scarecrow stood. Its head was tilted at a sickening angle, its arms stretched out like it was reaching for help. And if you listened closely, if you ignored the wind and the distant sound of laughter, you could still hear it whispering, begging, screaming. But no one ever listened. Because next year, someone else would take its place. The town of Killarney never talked about Cian Murphy.